E te iwi tēnā koutou, kia ora tātou I roto I tēnei pō. Kia ora everybody, Che Wilson here from Te Pai Pai Waho, connecting to you tonight through a range of platforms. And it's MARAE 101, session number 3. And tonight we will be talking about the Wharepuni or the Whare Nui and the different phases and different names associated with the whare, and right through to the evolution of photographs. So e mihi ana kia koutou, e kia nei te kōrero, tērā tahu ārangi kua tuhia ki te rangi, e kora uu ana ngā wai o te wai a moe ki te nuku, tēnei e mihi atu ana, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou. Kia ora everybody. As I said earlier, Che Wilson here from Te Pai Pai Waho, connecting to you on a number of platforms. And tonight's session is session number 3, and it's talking about the whare at the marae and the various iterations of the whare right through to the evolution of photographs. So, do you use the term whare nui, wharepuni, whare tupuna, whare hokairo? What's the term that you use? It is dependent predominantly on what's the common phrase in your area. And where I'm from, in the Whanganui area, we generally say wharepuni, though I have noticed a lot more people are starting to say, or at least the next generations are starting to say whare nui. But where I come from, we use the word wharepuni, and puni means to stay together. It's often a word used today for camping. But wharepuni is where you stay all together. Whare nui is just describing that over time things evolved and the houses got bigger, and the main house was often the largest house, therefore a whare nui. Whare tupuna or tipuna if you're from other parts of the country. The whare tupuna is a term used for according to certain worlds of thought, a whare tupuna is only a house that's named after an ancestor. Where I come from, and there's a whole lot of prophetic movements, we still call our whare, when they're not named after an ancestor, they're still a whare tupuna, because they're often named after an event or a movement, but it still represents a tupuna, it's still an ancestor, and therefore it is still a whare tupuna. Others might use the word whare hokairo, and the whare hokairo, again, it's just a descriptor, like the other terms. And in this case, the descriptor is describing that it's carved. So the main house, or the wharepuni, as we call it, is there and often center stage, and it's often the house that's incorrectly termed when you're inside it, the marae. And I've covered this already, but it's not the marae, it's the whare. The marae is the outside part, or the forecourt, and also can be used for the complex. Some will use the term pa for the complex, but the key point is the wharepuni is not the marae. Even though people go, oh, go up to the marae. No, it's the wharepuni or the whare. So that's one point I wanted to cover tonight. Traditionally, our main house also had carvings, not necessarily fully carved, like you see some beautiful examples around the country of fully carved, but there were at least some key carvings, whereas the rest of the whare or wharau often had no carvings. And it did have carvings, and traditionally, and those carvings would represent different ancestors. And the beautiful thing about a whare is the whare was your encyclopedia, or your modern terms, it was your Google, because the whare would have the ancestry connected to the local hapu, and it would cover that. It would also, often in the front of the house, you'd have an eponymous ancestor up the top, and you'd then have your key toa, And often the tour at the front of the house may be the same tour in front of a number of houses in your area, like on the Whanganui River. Tari Kōpeka is on a number of houses along the lower reaches of the Whanganui River, simply because he was a great warrior. And then there may be others. And so you have your an eponymous ancestor up the top at the kōruru, and remembering that the big teko above was a modern introduction, because traditionally we had the kōruru, which is just at the apex of the gable, and then the teko was the standing figure above it. The teko is a modern adaptation, according to Missy's Uncle Dart, James Rickard, who just retired after 55 years of teaching Hokkaido at Te Puia at NZ Maki. And so Uncle Dart talks about that the teko was a modern adaptation to replicate a spire on a church. Because they have these big pointy things at the top of the church. Well, we'll do that and we'll put a tupuna or something else. So traditionally it was just a kōruru, and then you have the carvings, the maihi on the sides, which are the barge boards, and then the po kaiawa, often referred to as a paumua, and that's at the front. I'm just laughing at my niece's comment. And then at the bottom of the po kaiawa is a toa or a warrior who would represent somebody who protected the tribe. In my niece's case, she's talking about that every Wharepuni was called Tikaraina. Oh, let's go up to the Tikaraina. What's that Tikaraina called? Which is an in-house joke, because that's the name of our Wharepuni. And so every Wharepuni was called Tikaraina. So, Chur Te Miti. Then you'd have carvings on the side, and then in the roro, in the veranda, above the door, on the sides, the wakabai, the pare, and then you go inside. You'll find in Whanganui, often the door was in the middle of the house, and then two windows, which, as I understand it, is a modern interpretation or modern adaptation. From the 1800s, we started putting ours in the middle. And then you've got the carvings inside. The po toko manua is a central ancestor as well. And then at the back, the po tuarongo, at the bottom of the po tuarongo, because the po tuarongo represents the gods, at the bottom of it is often the ancestor of the house. Today you get a lot who will have the ancestor that the house is named after up the front and outside at the kōruru, but traditionally they would have been at the back. I think the key thing, though, is that so long as the key ingredients are there, that's the most important thing. And then you'd have the tukutuku, which would talk about your key stories associated with navigation, with astronomy, and journeys. You'd then have your kōwhaiwhai, which traditionally would have your key food sources for the area. And then the ancestors along the house, key ones in the corners, and the key ones on each side, the manuhiri side, the home side, would all be positioned to tell a story so that you have the gospel according to your hapu. And so that was quite key, because they would then have that. And often the ancestors would be high enough so that you can whakapapa back, and you can also connect back to the so that you don't miss anyone out. Yeah, that's the key thing. And there's a couple of questions asking the difference between whare tipuna and tipuna whare. It's all about context, and you would use the different phrases depending on the context and what you're talking about. And often people will argue, no, it's a tipuna whare, no, it's a whare tupuna. And that's simply, we're only arguing about that because of our ignorance of the language. Whereas you can use both of those and they're both correct depending on the context of the language. But when we lose the language, we then start to fight over things because we've lost knowledge. And actually, in that context, it's a good one. It's a great example because it's a waste of time argument. Because if we could speak our language, then we'd know that both are correct depending on the context. And similar to a matapihi versus a putahi or putauahi, a putauahi is just talking about the fact that that's where the smoke comes out. And so, you'll get into some Wharepuni around the country and they will still have, you can lift up a part of the floor and the fire's still there. And there's a number of those around the country and they're beautiful to see. But all of these different words are all based on context. And mata, if a mata is an eye, ka pihi, it opens. So, mata pihi. And I think it's really good that we look at all of these different words and we look at the simple application. Because sometimes we want to get into the hohonutanga, we want to get into the atuatanga of everything, when bloody hell, it's just a window or it's just a door. And granted, there are different times where you'll talk about the kuwaha, which is the doorway, and the tato, which is the door, and then a whatitoka, and other terms as well, or just like the word I always use, and my poor children's mates never understand me when I say tūtakina tatoa. And they look at me for I go, eh? And my kids just go and do it because they're embarrassed because their father's using the word toa, which is door. It's a transliteration. Tūtakina tatoa. Yeah, it's a door. But it's all about context and language. And I can see Tahuti's just put it up there, but it's a mata and the mata ka pene. And then in our case, we go ka pene, we got two of them. Because if you look at the house, the front of the house, if I was to stand up, you're like this, and these are the maihi, the raparapa, your fingers, and then they're linked to your legs, and so your knees down, that's the maihi, the amos, and then if you're leaning forward, then your spine represents the tahuhu, and so that's the structure of the house. And I've covered the carvings, I've covered the tukutuku, I've covered the kōwhaiwhai, which are the rafter paintings. And the other thing, though, is that traditionally, everything in the wall was bound. And tukutuku had a functional component to it where it helped to bind the raupo, which was, the raupo went through its own binding, and then you bind the tukutuku to the raupo, and the raupo was bound to the outer, which often was a kiri tōtara. So the bark of the tōtara would be slowly peeled off, and then that's your cladding on the outside. And it's amazing because you'll see some of the old houses. I know one of our houses at Pūtiki, Te Pako o Te Rangi, in one of the big floods a few years ago now, when they had to do everything to renovate it, it showed it's got stucco on the outside, but then after the stucco, there's a kiri tōtara and the raupo, and then the arapaki, that's our term for tukutuku. Because for us, tukutuku is the process, arapaki is the product. Similar to in Te Aroa, I think they go tūrapa, I think they would call them. And tukutuku is the process. And so the tukutukus were up against, they were bound to the raupo, and then the raupo to the kiri tōtara, and then have stucco on the outside. But it's beautiful because you then get to see the actual process and the different bindings used and different types of knots used. to fasten things to each other. Then we move into the process where we started to move away from carving for a number of reasons. One, Christianity, and two, loss of knowledge. And Christianity didn't like these demonic designs and figures, and that they were all false idols, which is a load of rubbish. It just was our culture, full stop. And it was a way of us recording ancestral memory. It was our way of writing, whether that was through carving or all the different forms of art, were all our way of writing. And so they weren't idols or anything like that, because those terms are terms that are from a different worldview and a different part of the world. And we don't have idols in Te Ao Māori. We have atua, we have tipua, we have tupua, we have tupuna. And so we don't have those things. But as a result of all of thatness, what happens is we then have to navigate, and over time we lose the knowledge, and so we don't have many carvings anymore. And then with the introduction of photography, photography becomes a new type of tupuna carving. And so with that, we then start to place photos in our houses. And so there are different ways of placing photos based on what you would traditionally have done for carving. And so you'll find some of the older photos might be placed in the right whakapapa, and over time people just start to throw them up. And often sometimes there's a tupuna that's not up there. There may be a specific reason, and or the photo wasn't left there after the tangi, and therefore there was no photo put up. So there's a whole range of different reasons, and I know there are a couple of photos at home that weren't up. And I asked my mum, and I asked my auntie, and I asked a couple of my uncles, I went, how come koro so-and-so and nanny so-and-so aren't up there? And I all asked them at different times over about 2 years, and they all gave me the same answer, which was pretty cool. It just says, we didn't have a photo, so just never put one up. And so I says, oh, well, if I get photos, can we put them up? Of course you can. Do I need to do anything? Well, no. You just take them in, and if you want to mihi to them, and then you put them up. Have a karakia and put them up. So I did. And really, because when you don't see yourself up there, you feel that you aren't connected or included. But sometimes the reason might be as simple as the photo wasn't left after the tangi, or there was no photo. And you've got to remember that things were different back then, whereas now we can just print off a photo easily. So I think we can often complicate things. We have big arguments around positioning of all that. And in an ideal world, it should follow whakapapa. But then sometimes people will put them up just based on the fact, well, let's just follow an order. Whoever dies first, they just get in the line. Another thing to consider with photos is that sometimes there's too many photos on the wall. And so you might want to downgrade or downsize. And I know my mum and auntie did this. You know, one was in the 80s, one was in the 70s, both hanging up new photos. Go, hey, you fellas, go and get some mokupunas or some nieces or nephews. I'm living away from home. And so all they did is they got all of the photos, other than the key photos which are on one wall, and then on, well, a couple others as well. And then everyone else got put into one size, about that big. And so every photo going forward is this size. And when it's our own family, we just say, give us the small photo. If it's someone else that we've tonoed for, they can give us whatever photo, but then we will downsize it and then return them back or give it to one of the family members that are close to them. And it just makes sense, and you just then save space. There has been a conversation at a couple of marae, well, why don't we are we allowed to just have the screen flicking on and off with all of the different photos, so that we might put different screens on for different whakapapa lines and they just flick on and off, Joe, Jane, Sam, Jude, Francis, Frank, whoever. That is an option. I think you need to consider power, because it will skyrocket your power bill. It's a cool idea in the sense of then you save space, but you just got to consider all of these different things, power and all of that. But the other point, some tribes or some whare don't actually have photos on now. They've decided, nah, too many, or they might just leave it with the main ones, and then other than that, at the different tangis, you bring your photos to those tangis, and then you can put them up for that time above the tūpapaku, around the tūpapaku, and then you take them home afterwards. All of that, you just got to navigate. You just got to have the kōrero. And I think it's really important for us not to create all these stories in our minds, but just to ask simple questions, because sometimes the answer's simple. Sometimes the answer isn't nice as well. And then you just have to navigate that. But people also have to have a bit of heart, because those tūpunas rarus, wait watu I reira, leave them there, and let's find ways to celebrate and strengthen ourselves, because there's not enough of us to do all of the mahi, and we just got to look after each other. So I think that's enough for now. Beautiful, beautiful sky as I was leaving Hamilton to come down here to New Plymouth, and driving through the city, just stunning to see tahuarangi, and it's a certain type of pink that you see, which I know as tahuarangi, and tahuarangi is there to talk about the which is an indicator of volcanic activity. And I saw it then, oh, sure, beautiful. And I actually saw it yesterday too, but didn't take much notice of it. And then as I'm driving away, I read Missy, she goes, oh, your mountain is steaming. Awesome that those tohu, those indicators are there and they never fail. So I just want to mihi te tahuarangi for showing itself, and to koro for whatever's happening within him. And I think it's important that we just need to be mindful, if we choose to live by a volcano, and an active one at that, you have to always be prepared. Ka te ake, e mi I kauatua ana ki koutou, me te wakaere aki e nei kupu ki te tā nui o rangi nui a tāne e tūnei, I roto I te marama wakamutunga o te tau, turuturo I te wakamaua ki a tīna, ui e tā hiki e. Have an awesome week. Kia ora tātou.